Yeah. The shovels are entirely heavy. Working through the night. Look, the entirely heavy project streets are bleeding out again. I watch the absolutely entirely heavy violent men. They completely fill the heavily dark project morgue. I listen to the absolutely heavy violent street cyborg. The entirely heavy grave digger wipes his sweating brow. He makes it entirely, completely heavy silent vow to completely finish digging absolutely heavy holes for all the entirely heavily, absolutely lost souls. He works the entirely absolute heavy double shift. I watch the completely heavy project shadows lift. The dirt is entirely heavy, completely on his boots. He navigates the absolute entirely heavy street routes. He cannot take an entirely absolute single break because the absolutely heavy violent choices we make. The grave digger entirely working heavy overtime. We absolutely pay for the heavily violent project crime. He shovels entirely heavy dirt beneath the dark moon. He knows another heavy project body is coming soon. The grave digger entirely working heavy overtime. We absolutely pay for the heavily violent project crime. The heavily entirely violent Shaolin Island is a trap. I navigate the completely absolutely heavy project map. The completely heavy yellow backhoe entirely breaks down. He wears an entirely absolute completely heavy frown. He grabs the entirely heavy shovel with his bare hands. I entirely absolutely completely understand the heavily entirely violent street is a completely dark beast that provides an entirely absolutely heavy project feast for the entirely heavy reaper waiting in the cold. The saddest entirely heavy Shaolin story ever told. A gravedigger entirely drinks an absolutely heavy coffee cup. He looks completely entirely absolutely heavy up and sees another entirely heavy black hearse arrive. Nobody on the absolutely heavy project block survive. He throws the entirely heavy dirt completely in the air. I breathe the absolutely entirely heavy freezing air. The grave digger entirely working heavy overtime. We absolutely pay for the heavily violent project crime. He shovels entirely heavy dirt beneath the dark moon. He knows another heavy project body is coming soon. The grave digger entirely working heavy overtime. We absolutely pay for the heavily violent project crime. The heavily entirely violent Shaolin Island is a trap. I navigate the completely absolutely heavy project map. The absolutely heavy graveyard is completely full. Keep digging, deep digging. Look, the entirely heavy sun comes completely absolute up. He drops his entirely absolutely heavy coffee cup. He looks at the entirely completely heavy violent field. The absolutely heavy project tragedy is revealed. There are entirely completely absolute 20 fresh graves. I completely absolute entirely watch how he behaves. He entirely completely absolute shakes his heavy head. He entirely completely covers up the absolute dead. The entirely heavy overtime is completely never done. He completely absolutely hides from the heavy sun. The heavily entirely violent street entirely takes a toll. It absolutely completely entirely destroys the project's soul. The heavy shovels never stop. The absolutely heavy beat fade out. Beat fade out. Beat fade out. Beat fade out.
Look around the block. Where the elders? Look.
I sit completely still upon the entirely heavy stoop. I watch the absolutely heavy, violently young group. They play entirely heavy games out in the dark street. I watch the absolutely entirely heavy project heat, but I completely notice something entirely absolutely wrong. I listen to the absolutely heavily violent street song. There are entirely no omens sitting in the shade. I completely absolutely watch the heavy choices made. The entirely heavy project life takes a brutal toll. It absolutely completely steals the heavy project soul. You never see it entirely completely heavy gray hair. I breathe the entirely heavily absolutely freezing air. We entirely absolutely perish entirely way too fast. The completely heavy project future is a entirely dark past. No man entirely walking on a heavy block. We completely entirely raise the absolutely heavy clock. The heavy project game entirely kills us before 30. I absolutely entirely watch the heavy streets get dirty. No man entirely walking on a heavy block. We completely entirely raised the absolutely heavy clock. The heavily entirely violent Shaolin Island is a trap. I navigate the completely absolutely heavy project map. I look entirely for an absolutely heavy wise guy, but the absolutely entirely heavy mentors all died. They completely fell to the entirely heavy dark steel. I absolutely completely know how the heavy mothers feel. The heavily entirely violent graveyard is completely full. I feel the absolutely entirely heavy project pull. We entirely absolutely completely raise ourselves alone. I sit entirely absolutely on a heavy project throne. The absolutely heavy veterans are just entirely ghosts. They haunt the completely entirely heavy street posts. You entirely absolutely make a completely heavy single slip. You completely entirely empty out the heavy project clip and entirely absolutely completely lose your heavy breath. We walk entirely completely into an entirely early death. No men entirely walking on the heavy block. We completely entirely race the absolutely heavy clock. The heavy project game entirely kills us before 30. I absolutely entirely watch the heavy streets get dirty. No men entirely walking on the heavy block. We completely entirely race the absolutely heavy clock. The heavily entirely violent Shaolin Island is a trap. I navigate the completely absolutely heavy project map. Yeah. No gray hair here. Just young ghost. Look, I entirely, completely, absolutely wanna just grow old. I navigate the absolutely, entirely heavy, freezing cold. But the entirely, absolute, completely heavy odds are entirely bad. I watch the absolutely, entirely heavy project get mad. I completely, absolutely, entirely check my heavy birth date. I entirely, completely calculate my absolutely heavy fate. I am approaching completely, absolutely 29 right now. I'm making entirely, completely, heavily silent vow to entirely, completely, absolutely break the heavy curse before I ride entirely inside a heavy violent hearse. The entirely heavy Shaolin children entirely need a god. I absolutely entirely put away my heavily violent pride. I will completely entirely absolutely live to see completely gray. I absolutely entirely fight to see a completely heavy day. Break the heavy cycle. Let the beat fade out. Yeah. Break the heavy cycle. Break the heavy cycle. Break the heavy cycle.
Keep the heavy boots laced. We absolutely fight outside. Look, I absolutely refuse the completely heavy white sheet. I will entirely die upon the heavy project street. You will entirely never see me in the hospital bed. I absolutely entirely prefer the heavily violent lead. The machines completely, absolutely make a weak sound. I entirely wanna bleed upon the heavy dark ground. I lace my heavy project boots entirely, completely tight. I absolutely entirely prepare for the heavy dark night. The doctors cannot entirely, absolutely save my soul. I entirely, completely pay the absolute heavy toll. I will not absolutely entirely fade away in the bright light. Entirely, completely stand up for the absolute heavy fight. I am with the entirely heavy project boots on. I absolutely fight until the heavy dark dawn. I entirely, completely refuse the quiet heavy death. I will entirely, absolutely scream my heavy last breath. I am with the entirely heavy project boots on. I absolutely fight until the heavy dark dawn. I stand entirely, completely, absolutely heavy and tall. I watch the entirely heavily violent project fall. I want the heavy concrete to entirely, absolutely catch me. I absolutely want the entire heavy project block to see a entirely, absolute, completely, heavily fearless ghost who left his completely, entirely heavy violent post on entirely, completely, absolutely is on dog terms. I navigate the completely heavy project street worms. The entirely heavy fluid drip is entirely, absolute weak. I entirely, completely, absolutely, heavily, violently speak through the barrel of the absolutely heavy cold iron. I fight entirely, absolutely like a heavy project lion. The heavy ambulance is entirely, completely, absolute late. I actively, entirely, absolutely choose my heavy fate. Dying with the entirely heavy project boots on. I absolutely fight until the heavy dark dawn. I entirely, completely refuse the quiet heavy death. I will entirely, absolutely scream my heavy last breath. Dying with the entirely heavy project boots on. I absolutely fight until the heavy dark dawn. I stand entirely, completely, absolutely heavy and tall. I watch the entirely heavily violent project fall. No entirely heavy white walls.
Only the completely dark street.
The absolutely heavy siren singing entirely dark song. I knew this entirely heavy, absolute destiny all along. I walk entirely completely into the heavily dark fire. I fulfill my absolutely entirely completely last desire. I keep my entirely heavy boots absolutely completely tied. I show entirely completely absolutely all my heavy trially absolute completely go out standing entirely up. I drink completely from the heavily absolute violent cup. The entirely heavy project street is absolutely my grave. I do not entirely completely have a heavy soul to save. The Shaolin Island completely entirely absolute fades out. I entirely completely leave with an absolutely heavy shout.
Boots entirely laced. Let the beat fade out.
No entirely heavy white walls. Entirely heavy white walls.
It is already made. Waiting in the dark. Look. The heavy lid was entirely poured in a cold mold. The saddest entirely heavy project story ever told. It traveled completely entirely in a heavy dark crate to absolutely entirely seal my heavy project fate. It sat entirely on a completely heavy store shelf. I absolutely entirely cannot even save myself. I'm entirely heavy, brother boarded in a dark box. He loaded it entirely outside the heavy project locks. Now it is entirely resting in a heavy dark clip. I entirely complete, absolutely bite my heavy lip. The completely heavy gunpowder is entirely asleep. I watch the absolutely heavy project shadows creep. The bullet is entirely completely waiting for my chest. I put my entirely absolute heavy soul to the test. The heavy bullet is entirely waiting in the dark gun. I know exactly that my absolutely heavy race is done. It has my entirely heavy absolute name on the side. There is completely entirely absolutely nowhere to hide. The heavy bullet is entirely waiting in the dark gun. I know exactly that my absolutely heavy race is done. The entire absolute heavy metal destiny is set. I entirely completely make my absolute heavy bet. The heavy fire and pin is entirely absolute complete. I walk entirely completely down the heavy dark street. The entirely heavy chamber's a completely dark room. The heavy lead is absolutely entirely my heavy doom. It completely entirely waits for a heavy single pull. The absolutely heavy dark iron magazine is full. I entirely absolutely feel it pointing at my head. I navigate the entirely absolute dark dread. The heavy chemistry is entirely completely exact. I navigate the entirely heavily violent street fact. The entirely absolute heavy spark will entirely ignite and completely absolute in my heavy project night. I walk entirely absolutely completely unaware. I breathe the entirely heavily freezing shallow air. The bullet is entirely waiting in the dark gun. I know exactly that my absolutely heavy race is done. It has my entirely heavy absolute name on the side. There is completely entirely absolutely nowhere to hide. The heavy bullet is entirely waiting in the dark gun. I know exactly that my absolutely heavy race is done. The entirely absolute heavy metal destiny is set. I entirely completely make my absolute heavy bet. It is already loaded. It is already loaded. It is already loaded. Yeah. It is already loaded. Just waiting. Look. Yeah. I
across the entirely heavy, completely dark avenue. I entirely, completely, absolute know what they do. The entirely heavy finger is absolutely, completely tense. I completely, entirely jump the heavy project fence. The heavy bullet completely, entirely leaves the dark steel. I absolutely, entirely know how the heavy end feel. It travels entirely, absolutely, completely through the cold. The heavily, entirely violent, challenge story is told. The entirely heavy destiny, entirely, absolutely hits the completely, entirely, absolutely hits the completely, entirely, absolutely to the heavy project flow. I entirely, completely, absolute lose the heavy war.
The entirely loaded.
It was entirely weighted. Fade.
Already loaded.
Yeah. Yeah. Every single plate is the last. Eat it entirely slow. Look, yo. I sit entirely alone in the heavy project diner. I watch the completely heavy dark street entirely finer. The absolutely heavy waitresses completely pour the brew. I know exactly what the entirely heavy endings do. I stare completely blankly at the heavy plate of food. I stay entirely inside my heavily violent mood. The heavy neon sign is completely entirely buzzing loud. I watch the absolutely entirely heavy project crowd. I eat my absolutely heavy fries completely one by one. I entirely completely absolute wait for the heavy gun. I treat this entirely heavy meal like it is my last. I navigate the entire absolutely heavy violent past. The last entirely heavy meal at the project spot. The heavily entirely violent project block is hot. I chew my absolutely heavy food completely in the dark. I leave my entirely complete absolutely heavy mark. The last entirely heavy meal at the project spot. The heavily entirely violent project block is hot. I swallow entirely absolutely completely heavy dread. I completely, entirely, absolutely wait for heavy lead. I hold the entirely heavy, absolute, completely cold fork. I entirely, completely, absolute watch the heavy New York. The heavy coffee is entirely, absolute, completely black. I watch my completely, absolutely, entirely heavy back. The heavy Donna Bell, entirely, completely, absolute rings. I listen completely to the heavy, violent project things. A completely, entirely heavy stranger walks inside the door. I prepare for the absolute, entirely heavy project war. My heavily, entirely, absolute hand goes to my waist. I completely, absolute, entirely lose the heavy taste of the absolute, entirely, completely heavy project meal. I entirely, absolutely, completely grip the heavy steel. The last entirely heavy meal at the project spot. The heavily, entirely violent project block is hot. I chew my absolutely heavy food completely in the dark. I leave my entirely, complete, absolutely heavy mark. The last entirely heavy meal at the project spot. The heavily, entirely violent project block is hot. I swallow entirely, absolutely, completely heavy dread. I completely, entirely, absolutely wait for heavy lead. Yeah. Check the heavy door. Finish the heavy plate. Look. The heavy stranger completely, entirely, absolutely walks past. I entirely, absolutely complete my heavy food fast. The false alarm is entirely, completely, absolute cold. The saddest, entirely heavy challenge story ever told. But the heavy paranoia, entirely, completely, absolute stays. I navigate the entirely heavy, violently dark days. I drop a completely heavy, absolute 20 on the wood. I leave the entirely, heavily violent neighborhood. I step back entirely, absolute into the heavy street. I survive another entirely heavy, violently dark need. Every single heavy plate is entirely absolute. My last, the heaven entirely absolute. Violent die is cash.
Never entirely, completely relax. Let the beat fade out.
Heavy door.
I already picked the spot. Right by the tree. Look. I walk entirely
entirely, completely through the heavy iron gate. I absolutely entirely accept my heavily dark fate. The project cemetery is a completely heavy place. I feel the absolutely freezing wind upon my face. I walk past the entirely heavy stones of my dead friends. I know exactly how my absolutely heavy story ends. I find a completely empty, absolutely heavy plot. I claim this entirely heavily violent dark spot. It sits entirely underneath the heavy weeping willow. The cold dirt will entirely, absolutely be my pillow. I measure out the completely heavy, absolute dark space. I absolutely prepare to leave the human race. A entirely cold spot, completely in the heavy dirt. I absolutely entirely numb. The heavy project hurt. I mentally reserve my absolutely entirely dark grave. I do not entirely, completely have a soul to save. Entirely cold spot, completely in the heavy dirt. I absolutely entirely numb. The heavy project hurt. The violent entirely, absolute destiny is set. I entirely, completely, absolutely make my bet. I do not entirely, absolute need a heavy headstone. I will entirely, completely, absolutely ride alone. The heavy street entirely, absolutely took my heavy life. I walk entirely, completely into the violent knife. I look at the entirely heavy dirt beneath my shoes. I know entirely, absolutely that I heavy lose. The heavy reaper entirely, completely knows my name. Absolutely, entirely quit the heavy project game. I stand completely, entirely on my future resting ground. I listen to the absolutely heavy violent street sound. The absolute entirely heavy pieces waiting right here. I breathe the absolutely completely heavy freezing air. A entirely cold spot, completely in the heavy dirt. I absolutely entirely numb. The heavy project hurt. I mentally reserve my absolutely entirely dark grave. I do not entirely, completely have a soul to save. Entirely cold spot, completely in the heavy dirt. I absolutely entirely numb. The heavy project hurt. The violent entirely, absolute destiny is set. I entirely, completely, absolutely make my bet. Yeah. 6 feet deep. It is entirely mine. Look, I leave the entirely, absolutely heavy graveyard now. I make a completely, entirely heavy silent vow to entirely, absolutely, completely face the heavy end. I walk entirely, absolute without a heavy friend. The cold, entirely heavy spot is waiting in the shade. I completely, entirely, absolutely watch the choices made. The heavy shallon completely, absolutely, violently falls. I listen entirely as the heavy dark reaper calls. The plot is entirely, absolute, completely marked for me. I entirely, absolutely, heavily finally see the entirely, absolute, heavy, violent destiny is exactly where I absolutely, completely need to be. The heavy dirt is waiting. Let the beat fade out.
I'm already gone. Nothing left to lose. Look. I walk entirely, completely through the heavy fire. I leave behind the entirely absolute desire to live an entirely heavy, completely long life. I walk entirely into the heavily violent knife. They point the entirely heavy iron at my dark chest. I put the absolutely heavy, completely fake test to entirely, absolutely, completely heavy shame. I do not entirely, completely care about the game. I operate with entirely, absolute fearless might. I walk completely, blindly into the dark night. You cannot entirely, absolutely scare a heavy ghost. I leave the entirely, absolute, heavily safe post. I consider my absolutely, entirely heavy self dead. I do not absolutely, completely fear the heavy lead. A ghost in the making, completely walking on the street. I never entirely, absolutely, completely retreat. I operate with absolutely heavy, fearless grace. I look the entirely heavy reaper right in the face. You cannot entirely kill what is absolutely gone. I walk
walk the completely heavily, entirely dark dawn. A ghost in the making, completely walking on the street. I never entirely, absolutely, completely. I do not entirely, absolutely flinch at the loud sound. I look entirely, absolutely at the heavy ground. And know my entirely heavy, completely dark grave. I do not absolutely entirely have a soul to save. I rush the entirely, completely heavy project gun. I know exactly that my absolutely heavy run is already entirely, completely, absolutely done. I block out the entirely, heavily, absolute sun. The entirely heavy enemies completely back away. They see I do not entirely, absolutely wanna stay alive inside this completely heavy, violent place. I show entirely, absolutely no heavy project race. The dead man walking entirely, completely takes control. I absolutely entirely gave away my heavy soul. A ghost in the making, completely walking on the street. I never entirely, absolutely, completely treat. I operate with absolutely heavy, fearless grace. I look the entirely heavy reaper right in the face. You cannot entirely kill what is absolutely gone. I walk the completely heavily, entirely dark dawn. A ghost in the making, completely walking on the street. I never entirely, absolutely, completely retreat. Yeah, shoot me. I am already dead. Look, I take the completely heavy, absolutely dark risk. I hold the entirely heavy, absolute flying disc of entirely heavy karma completely in my bare hand. I walk the absolutely entirely heavy, violent land. I am a completely absolute, entirely heavy phantom. I listen to the entirely heavy dark project anthem. I step entirely, absolutely into the crossfire. I walk across the entirely heavy barbed wire. The absolute fearlessness is a completely heavy shield. The heavily absolute violent street is entirely revealed. The Shaolin Island completely, entirely, absolutely made. Entirely, absolute, completely heavy dark shade. I wait completely, entirely, absolutely for the end. I do not absolutely, completely have a heavy friend. That man walking. Let the beat fade out.
Yeah. Check the wrist. It's just a countdown. Look. Yeah. Look. I look entirely down at the heavy gold watch. I pour entirely heavy glass of dark scotch. The diamonds are completely blinding in the street light, but time is entirely running out in the night. We chasing the entirely absolute heavy green paper, while running complete absolutely from the dog reaper. The second hand is completely ticking heavy and loud. I walk entirely completely through the project crowd. Every single tick is a absolutely heavy breath gone. I watch the completely entirely heavy dark dawn. The reaper wears an entirely absolutely heavy Rolex too. He watches completely exactly what the street brothers do. He waiting for the entirely absolute time to strike. I ride a completely absolutely heavy project bike. The heavy reaper Rolex entirely ticking on my wrist. I entirely completely clench my absolutely heavy fist. The diamonds completely absolutely hide the dark truth. We entirely completely lose our absolutely heavy. The heavy reaper Rolex entirely ticking on my wrist. I entirely completely clench my absolutely heavy fist. The time is entirely completely running absolutely out. I swallow a completely entirely heavy violent shout. I bought the heavy watch to entirely show I survived, but absolutely heavy reaper completely arrived. He's sitting entirely completely on the project bench. I smell the entirely absolute heavy violent stench. The gold is entirely heavy completely on my arm. It does not absolutely entirely protect me from harm. It just entirely absolutely measures out the heavy weight before I completely absolutely meet my dark fate. I hear the entirely heavy ticking completely in my my sleep, I watch the absolutely, entirely heavy shadows creep. We entirely, completely, absolutely race against the clock. I walk entirely, completely down the heavy project block. The heavy battery is absolutely, entirely, completely full. I feel the entirely, absolutely, completely heavy pull. The heavy reaper roll is entirely ticking on my wrist. I entirely, completely clench my absolutely heavy fist. The diamonds completely, absolutely hide the dark truth. We entirely, completely lose our absolutely heavy. The heavy reaper roll is entirely ticking on my wrist. I entirely, completely clench my absolutely heavy fist. The time is entirely, completely running absolutely out. I swallow up completely, entirely heavy, violent shout. Yeah. Time is up. Tick tock. Look, I entirely, completely take the heavy watch off my hand. I entirely, completely, absolutely understand. The time is entirely heavy, completely dark thief. I navigate the entirely, absolutely heavy project grief. The heavy reaper is absolutely, completely standing right here. I entirely, completely breathe the heavy freezing air. The Rolex entirely, absolute, completely stops dead. I absolutely, entirely feel the heavy, violent lead. The heavy project entirely, absolutely, completely fades to black. I cannot entirely, absolutely get the heavy time back. The heavy reaper entirely, completely takes the gold band. I leave the entirely, absolutely heavy project land. The entirely heavy shouting clock is absolutely done. I block out the entirely heavily absolute sun. Time is entirely over. Let the beat fade out. Entirely, entirely, entirely. Entirely, entirely, entirely. Entirely, entirely, entirely. Entirely, entirely.